The Subcommittee on National Security, the Border, and Foreign Affairs will come to order. Welcome, everyone. Without objection, the chair may declare a recess at any time, and without objection, Representative Mike Waltz of Florida is waived onto the subcommittee for the purpose of questioning witnesses at today's subcommittee hearing. I recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. Thank you all for coming to today's hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for coming to testify on this important topic of military readiness. I'm proud to say the United States has the best and strongest military of the world. From our special operations to intelligence and reconnaissance, to our air power strength, to our precision strike capabilities, our military capabilities are in a league of their own. We all know the primary mission of the armed forces is to protect and defend the nation and our interests abroad. However, I'm afraid, I'm talking to some people in the military is not the institution for social experiments and political correctness. The administration seems to be willfully blinded by how its progressive ideals are affecting military readiness and recruitment. Not once in the Biden administration's national security strategy released in October 22nd does it address the military recruitment crisis we are having. Today's hearing will examine how the Biden Department of Defense has politicized the U.S. military and harmed its ability to quickly respond to threats in our nation. In 2022, the Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marines all fell short of their recruitment goals. Despite lowering fitness standards, relaxing tattoo policies, and increasing recruitment bonuses, fewer and fewer young adults are joining our military. Meanwhile, the Biden administration is more focused on how cadets at military academies use correct pronouns rather than to learn how to lead, work as a team, or defend our nation. The Biden administration thinks that service members understanding white rage, as recently described by General Mark Milley, our highest-ranking military official, is more important than promoting cohesiveness throughout the armed services. Furthermore, this administration has allowed active duty service members to take time off from their duties to obtain sex change surgeries and related hormones and drugs at taxpayer expense. Legislation has been introduced in Congress that would stop the teaching of critical race theory, or CRT, in the military, stop the millions of dollars flowing to the creation of diversity and inclusion offices, and would keep the thresholds high for physical fitness requirements by our combat forces. Service members within the ranks are speaking out about these issues, while military leadership continues to push the Biden administration's progressive agenda. Data shows most Americans still trust our military, but this trust cannot be taken for granted. The Biden administration continues to exploit the military for political purposes and for experiments in social policy. Today, our panel of experts will be able to shine a light on how these progressive ideologies are harming our men and women in uniform. Again, thank you for all being here today, and I look forward to your testimony. I'd now like to recognize my good friend, Ranking Member Garcia, for the purpose of making an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to just begin by thanking our witnesses for being here as well. I think we can all agree that our national security and protecting our great nation and the lives and safety of Americans is incredibly important and remains very strong today. We should also be very clear, and I think everyone can agree here as part of this committee, that our military is still the strongest in the world. We are leading global coalitions across the country, in Europe, across Asia, and of course we know that the U.S. spends more on national defense than China, India, Russia, the UK, Saudi Arabia, Germany, France, Japan, and South Korea, all combined. And so we continue to invest in our military. And we, of course, need to welcome the conversation of how we do better. But this hearing today is not really focused on how we can do better. It's focused on issues around what it means to be progressive, or what is being perceived to be happening in our military. It's important that we do not politicize our military, that we do not focus on partisan issues. We shouldn't be focused on the issues that will be brought up today by my Republican colleagues, but instead we should focus on what studies and what the facts and the data actually say are causing issues around diminishing recruitment and retention. These are issues around sexual violence that we know still exists in the military, the need for improved mental health support for our service members, the need for reliable and affordable child care, which are incredibly important, and so many others. Even recent numerous studies have shown that sexual assault mental health care, and affordable child care still remain the key factors in military recruitment, retention, and readiness. But none of those real factors are, unfortunately, what's going to be much of the focus here at this Oversight Committee today. We want to ensure, and as our most senior military leaders know and have pointed out, that focusing on the broader, bigger issues has to be a national priority. In fact, in the words of the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, General Miley, he quoted, "I personally find it offensive that we are accusing the United States military of being woke or something else because we're studying some theories that are out there." I fully agree with the general and that our warfighters should be open-minded and be widely read because they come from the American people. These are quotes. Now, here are the facts. America is not the same as it was in the 1960s. We know that. We're recruiting from a generation of young people who are the most diverse in American history. We need to draw on their talents now more than ever. The U.S. military needs all of our best and brightest, and that includes women, LGBTQ+ people, and people from all across this country. Our military needs are changing, and I hope that today we can focus on those broader issues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
It's the first time behind this podium. I'm pleased to introduce our four witnesses today. First of all, Brent Sadler joined the Heritage Foundation after a 26-year naval career with numerous operational tours on nuclear-powered submarines, served on the personnel staffs of senior Department of Defense leaders, and also served as a military diplomat. As a senior research fellow, Mr. Sadler has heavily focused on the future of maritime forces and issues facing the U.S. Navy strategy. Secondly, we have Meaghan. As an experienced policy leader, she's a graduate of West Point, holds a master's in forensic psychology from George Washington and a doctorate in clinical psychology from Columbia. She previously served as a presidential appointee to the U.S. Military Academy, West Point Board of Advisors, and is currently gubernatorial appointee to the Virginia Military Institute Board of Visitors. Next, we have Jeremy Hunt. Currently serves as chairman for Veterans on Duty, an organization that advocates for strong military and national security policies. Mr. Hunt's a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and previously served as an active duty military intelligence officer, where he was deployed as part of a multinational mission to train the Ukrainian Armed Forces. He now serves in the U.S. Army in active ready reserve as he completes his final year at Yale Law School. I think you have a strong enough background, you can make it through there unscathed. And most importantly, last week he welcomed his second child to the world. Congratulations, Mr. Hunt. Finally, Lieutenant General David Barno is a visiting professor of strategic studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. General Barno completed a 30-year active duty Army career, served as an infantry officer, ranger, and paratrooper. General Barno currently serves on the Secretary of Defense's Reserve Forces Policy Board and is a member of the U.S. Army War College Board of Visitors. Again, thank you for all being here today. Pursuant to Committee Rule 9G, the witnesses will please stand and raise their right hands. Do you solemnly swear to affirm that the testimony that you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show that the witnesses all answered in the affirmative, right? Yep. Good. Okay, we appreciate you all being here today again. You can sit down. Appreciate you all being here again today and look forward to your testimony. Let me remind the witnesses that we have read your written statements and they will appear in full in the record. We all should have read them all. Please limit your oral statements to as close to 5 minutes as you can get. As a reminder, please press the button on the microphone in front of you so that it's on and we can all hear you. When you begin to speak, the light in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, it will turn yellow. When the red light comes on, your 5 minutes are up, and please wrap up. I recognize, first of all, Mr. Sadler, to begin your opening statement.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Chairman Rothman and Ranking Member Garcia, and members of the House. The root cause of why we are here today stems from the corrosive impact recent policies are having on our all-volunteer military. While ostensibly noble, a growing cadre of DEI staffers across the military, backed by a $114 million budget, a 33% increase over last year, and several executive orders are having a divisive impact. As a 27-year Navy veteran, it's clear a course correction is needed. To be totally clear, diversity has enabled battlefield advantages, like Code Talker Navajo Marines of World War II, or female soldiers able to engage Afghan women for intel. Yes, the military appreciates diversity, but it's more than balancing skin tones on a roster. Inclusion. In the military is everyone being held to the same standards and a common desire for operational success. Inclusion without this in mind risks unit cohesion and camaraderie, good measures of effective military inclusion, not numbers of categories present of gender, sexuality, etc., and certainly not excluding those who do not share popular political or social views. And equity. Equity becomes problematic if actualized to balance outcomes, running contrary to a military meritocracy. When paired with Marxist theories of critical race theory, espousals of America as systematically racist or assigning groups oppressor-oppressed roles as rationale for limiting or curtailing a person's access to services or career options based on immutable difference characteristics is racist and un-American. By featuring on military professional reading list authors such as Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, discrimination is seemingly normalized. The embrace of such thinking has led to a perception that the military is no longer an egalitarian society where hard work and self-improvement can get you far. Such perceptions were furthered when racist tweets by a DoD official came to light and suffered no apparent meaningful repercussion. The real question is how the DoD hired someone with such a problematic public background to be chief of diversity, inclusion, and equity. The message to half of the military and their children in DoD schools: you are valued less. All service members matter, but amidst the emotions of 2020's riots, anti-establishment protest, and a presidential election, too many lost sight of this. The damage done. Military Family Advisory Network polls showed a 11.6% drop from 2019 in veterans recommending family members join the military. Confidence in the military has also hit new lows. Pew Research, 9% down. Gallup poll, 5% decline. And finally, Reagan Institute's a 22% drop. The perception today is of a military increasingly captured by a political agenda, leading some to forgo military service. The nation is weaker for this. To be clear, not all recruits or officer candidates begin their careers with the same aptitudes, often a function of poorly performing schools or unhelpful family situations. The military and Congress should find ways to get more willing patriots from such conditions within standards for the military and for the most promising extra academic training so that they may be even more successful in the long term. This nurturing comes with added cost and time for sure. Until 2008, the Navy had a program called Boost that did much the same. Perhaps a reimagined and expanded Boost program can deliver on diversity and inclusion based on rewarding hard work while not alienating segments of the military. On top of this, the military needs help in getting access to educate more people about what military service is. It is a noble profession. And when a high school student gets to talk with a Marine, sailor, airman, or soldier only 3 or 4 years older than themselves, and likely from the same town, trust is highest. But too often, parts of the country are devoid of that type of exchange. This too must change. True, most in uniform go about their daily routines and operations much as they always have. That is not to say corrosive influences are not at play, as evidenced by several unfortunate incidents. Should military members see their opportunities narrowing and themselves being undervalued, they will vote with their feet. Retention is a lagging factor, and it is showing signs of trouble. Recruitment is a leading indicator. For the Army last year, it was a historic failure, short 25% of 15,000 people, with next year looking to be worse. It is already the worst since the all-volunteer force came into being in 1973. COVID and economics do not explain this, but it does correlate with an added emphasis on DEI and increasing CRT-informed training. The problems are not caused by congressional oversight or people asking tough questions. In fact, the surest way to reverse course is demand transparency in all DEI-related activities within DoD, and doing so allows for needed adjustments in rebuilding confidence. The military is a meritocracy, or at least the closest to one existing today, because the environment in which it operates is unforgiving, where competency and unit cohesion often determine survival. The military is of and serves all Americans. Sadly, the military has not been served as well.
Chairman Grothman, Ranking Member Garcia, and members of the committee, it is a privilege to be here today both professionally and personally. My name is Dr. Meaghan, and I am the daughter of 2 former Army officers. My mother was one of the first women to go to airborne school and deployed to Grenada. My father served for over 30 years, deployed and was decorated for valor numerous times, and was in the Pentagon on 9/11 when I was a sophomore in high school. It was their footsteps I followed when I chose to serve and accepted an appointment to West Point. I was the first in my family to attend the academy, and my little brother eventually followed my footsteps and did the same. My nuclear family has served in every major conflict from Vietnam to the present day. I am now the mother to 2 exceptional little girls and the aunt to 2 energetic nephews. As it stands, and it pains me to say, I would not recommend military service to them. Understandably, our military cannot function as family business, with children of service members the predominant source of the force. However, it was until recently a reliable pool of candidates. That is changing, as I am not alone in my hesitation. Deficits in recruitment potential for military families is just one facet of the broader crisis facing our armed forces. Most concerningly, the desire in our youth to serve is only 9%. This is a grave national security threat. Just yesterday, the Wall Street Journal reported on a poll which demonstrated the priorities that help define our national character for generations are declining in importance. One of the variables, patriotism, falling from 70% in extreme importance in 1998 to just 38% today. Relatedly, Republicans, Democrats, and independents show double-digit declines in national pride compared with 2013. Pride is an imperative human emotion, particularly pride in the self. Feelings of pride reinforce positive social behaviors like altruism and lead to adaptive behaviors like achievement. Conversely, people who are deliberately shamed, even over a modest violation of social norms, are at much greater risk for depression and anxiety. And if they are repeatedly shamed, they're less likely to take positive risk-taking behaviors that can lead to success in adulthood. While pride in self and pride in nation may not necessarily be related, it's highly likely that both are contributing factors in the decision-making process to join the armed forces. It is for this reason that curricula or instruction which hyper-focus negatively on immutable characteristics are destructive both to the self and to esprit de corps. Moreover, a consistent centering of what divides us rather than what unites us is particularly pernicious. This is not to call into question the necessity of grappling with the complexity of the historical past. It is the manner in which it is currently being done in many of our educational settings and lamentably in the Department of Defense and at our service academies. These programs do not build teams, they destroy them. Moreover, there is a unique danger in telling those who are called to fight our nation's battles that the very notion they are expected to sacrifice and potentially die for is inherently bad. No good leader would say diversity is a bad thing. Diversity of all types, to include those often not considered, such as cognitive diversity and diversity of experience, build strong teams. The sole function of our military is to deter our nation's enemies, and if that fails, to fight and win our nation's war. We are no longer in competition with China, we are in conflict. A failure to recognize and reorient towards those demands will be disastrous. This necessary reorientation will require close examination of decades of multiple military failures with little to no accountability and poor command climate and culture, which is decimating our ranks. Some of the most detrimental decisions have been the casual disregard of data in favor of a political agenda. One such example was the out-of-hand rejection of a 2015 study done by the Marine Corps, which found that gender-integrated combat formations did not move as quickly or shoot as effectively as all-male formations. At that time, many of the disparities were dismissed and reframed as opportunities to train women more comprehensively with a push towards equal standards. Neither the Marines nor the Army followed through. To date, across the services, there are differences in physical standards for men and women. That is not helpful for women, and it makes it more difficult for them to earn trust and confidence of those they serve alongside. Make no mistake, that is not to say that women cannot fight or contribute. In fact, it is often when we recognize the biological differences between men and women that we increase lethality. An example of that is the heroic and lauded efforts of the cultural support teams in our most recent conflicts. Their conceptualization was rooted in the recognition that women and womanhood were unique and thereby would allow access for them to places that men could not go. It is the frequent Department of Defense denials of reality and their unwillingness to confront hard truths which places lethality at risk. For example, President Biden signed an executive order in 2021 to embed diversity, equity, inclusion in all federal agencies, with the overarching goal being advancing equity for all. There is no equity for combat, and there should not be a push for it in our society. Forced equality, which is equity by definition, leads to a lack of competition. This does not level playing fields for the positive, it flattens capability. The military should and must be standards-based and a meritocracy. The problem with recruitment and retention in our military are long in the making, and it will be long in the fixing. Business as usual is no longer an option as we look to the pacing threat of China. The world is an increasingly dangerous place, and for now, warfare remains a predominantly human endeavor. It is Americans who fill our ranks and operate our weapon systems, and our current and future men and women need legislators willing to hold the Department of Defense accountable for its failings and to demand results. There's a phrase often used in the military, getting left of bang. It means you've accurately observed pre-event indicators for what's to come and acted proactively to prevent it. Being on the opposite end means being right of bang. We are now right of bang and headed to a much louder one if we fail to heed the alarm bells ringing. I look forward to your questions, and thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hunt.
Good afternoon, Chairman Grothman, Ranking Member Garcia, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today about the state of our military's readiness. I'm Jeremy Hunt, and I have the honor of serving as chairman of Veterans on Duty, which is a nonprofit policy advocacy organization made up of veterans who are concerned about the state of our military and the strength of our national security. Many of us have deployed to Afghanistan, Iraq, and in my case, Ukraine. And during my time on active duty as an intelligence officer, I helped train the Ukrainian armed forces for what was then a hypothetical scenario of Russia launching an invasion against Ukraine. 5 years later, I watched footage of Yavor Training Center in Lviv, where I lived for many months, become engulfed in flames following a Russian attack. That footage reminded me yet again that our adversaries abroad are more emboldened than ever. And it's not just Russia. China continues its multi-generational effort to supplant the United States as the world's leading superpower. The CCP to this day is building hypersonic missiles that our radar systems can barely detect. And of course, threats remain from barbaric regimes in North Korea and Iran. In light of these rising threats, there is growing concern that our United States military simply isn't ready. We stand amid a once-in-a-generation military recruitment crisis. At the end of fiscal year 2022, the Army fell 15,000 soldiers short of its recruiting goal, missing by 25%. Our military is facing the worst recruitment challenge since the advent of the all-volunteer force following the Vietnam War. And apart from these manning shortfalls, other readiness issues abound. Just last year, the Navy reported $2 billion in shipyard backlogs for their service fleet. This report came during the same year that the USS Connecticut, an indispensable fast attack submarine, crashed into an underwater seamount entirely due to avoidable human error. Avoidable accidents abound in the sky as well. The National Commission on Military Aviation Safety found that from 2013 to 2020, our military lost 224 personnel and 186 aircraft worth over $11.6 billion to avoidable aircraft accidents. There are many factors that have led us to this dangerous position. Global supply chain challenges have made it difficult for the services to maintain their vehicles and equipment. Low nationwide unemployment rates have created a challenging environment for military recruitment. And of course, with rising teen obesity rates, data shows that only about 23% of America's youth are even eligible to enlist. These factors do matter and play an important role in this recruitment crisis. However, these are factors beyond the military's control. I'd like to focus on a few things that the military can control. The Reagan Institute annually conducts a Trust in the Military poll, which analyzes the public's faith and confidence in the military. It should be of concern that the survey found an astonishing double-digit decrease in the number of Americans with strong confidence in our armed forces. And the Pew Research Center had similar findings. This politicization of our military can be best described in terms of priorities and practices. That is, the things that the Pentagon says are important, the priorities, and the things that the Pentagon does, the practices. When Secretary Austin was sworn into office, he rightly identified China as a pacing threat, but he also identified and started expressing an emphasis on policies atypical to the military's core purpose. He included a huge amount of emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion, domestic extremism, and climate change. These are priorities that are more appropriate to the domestic political debates. And they just don't, and it's an odd fit for an institution purposed for a violent clash of arms against a tough and determined adversary. This has led to the perception that the Pentagon serves a political party rather than the American people as a whole. As a matter of practices, the Pentagon has followed through on this political agenda. In the wake of the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision, Secretary Austin made an unprecedented political announcement that the Department of Defense would pay for service members and their families to travel to different states to receive abortions and offer 3 weeks of paid vacations for those seeking these abortions, shoving the Department of Defense into one of the most polarizing political issues of our time. Further, recent presidential administrations have ordered the replacement of long-standing equal opportunity programs with an entirely new DEI bureaucracy. The current program subjects some service members to 11-week resident DEI training classes. All this despite there being no measurable increase in racist incidents that demonstrated a need for such a dramatic increase in the number of DEI bureaucrats or such an extreme training requirement. As America watches the Chinese military grow in power in the largest land war in Europe since the Second World War unfold, we are given the impression that our military serves other masters beyond our national defense. The Pentagon cannot magically make American teens fit for duty or eager to serve, nor can they reverse cultural considerations beyond their control. But we can change the recent policies that have left our military unfocused, untrained, unmanned, and unprepared for combat. Congress has an opportunity to take politics out of the military and refocus the Department of Defense back to what it was made to do, to deter, fight, and win our nation's wars. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Lieutenant General Barno.
Chairman Grothman, Ranking Member Garcia, thanks for inviting me to speak here today. As we all have heard, the U.S. military is facing a recruiting crisis in the year 2023 of unprecedented magnitude. I served for 30 years of my life on active duty in the U.S. Army and commanded U.S. forces at every level from lieutenant to lieutenant general. I served in combat 3 times, culminating in my 19 months as the overall U.S. commander in Afghanistan during the early days of the war. And yet I've never seen a greater challenge to the all-volunteer force than the one we see today. This crisis has many complex causes, but so-called wokeism in the military is not one of them. Let me be clear. There are no data that support the argument that wokeism has precipitated a decline in U.S. combat readiness, nor is there any correlation between wokeism and the current difficulty in attracting new recruits. However, in my view, the overheated and unsupported rhetoric on this topic does have harmful consequences, which exacerbates the recruiting crisis and undermines military effectiveness in ways that are the exact opposite of what all of us intend. Since the draft ended in 1973, the U.S. military has had to fill its ranks with volunteers at every level. Every military mission since then has been conducted by high-quality volunteers who have rightfully earned the esteem of the nation. Yet today, that force is at risk. As you heard, the Army missed its recruiting goals last year, and the other services barely met theirs. The current year's prospects for all appear equally dim. If the trends for the Army alone continue, service officials have warned that the Army could shrink by over 30,000 soldiers between 2022 and the end of 2023, or nearly 7% of its active force. If these trends don't change, the lack of qualified and motivated volunteers will jeopardize the national security of the United States by leaving our military too small to address the challenges and threats of the years and decades ahead. U.S. military recruiting today faces a crisis in both eligibility, those who are qualified to serve, and in propensity, those who want to serve. The percentage of young Americans who meet the military's entrance standards has hovered around 30% for more than a decade, but last year that number suddenly dropped to an all-time low of 23%. This is a shockingly low number that threatens the viability of the all-volunteer force. Equally disturbing is the other half of the equation, the propensity or willingness, interest in serving. Before the pandemic, polls showed that only 13% of young Americans said they would consider military service. Last year, that number shrank further to a mere 9%. These figures are simply unsustainable for the volunteer military to remain a robust, high-quality force. Too few recruits means a shrinking military at a time when the strategic threats facing the nation continue to multiply. The services are developing some innovative ways to deal with this. The Army has developed a pre-boot camp program that the Navy has now copied. Other services are looking at that as well. They're also examining ways to revisit some of the medical conditions that are now so commonplace in our society that have previously been disqualifications for military service, such as successful treatment for ADHD or depression as a child. These need to be looked at carefully in terms of increasing potential eligibility numbers. Finally, propensity to serve. How to get more young Americans to consider military service is a tougher problem. Although the all-volunteer force has seen great success, it has one tremendous Achilles heel. It has created an ever-widening gap between the U.S. military and the American people. Fewer and fewer young Americans today are exposed to the U.S. military. As we've heard, the U.S. military has become increasingly a family business. Today, more than 80% of the young people who join the military have a family member in the military. Between 25 and 30% have a parent in the military. Congress can help improve the propensity to serve by extolling the virtues of service in uniform in the ways that were commonplace throughout the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Repeatedly and publicly castigating the U.S. military as a woke institution is both wrong and directly undercuts efforts at military recruiting among swaths of young American men and women. It effectively discourages our young men and women from serving in uniform at the very time when the services are struggling with this challenge. Recruiting young Americans demands that the military find ways to attract more people who would otherwise not consider military service. To do that and to retain the very best of those, it has always emphasized equal opportunity for all, regardless of race, creed, or color. Put unequivocally, military efforts to recognize that diversity, equity, and inclusion within the force are both valuable and essential. They've long been part of our force structure. The military is a team of team. It's a remarkably diverse force built on different people that make up the strength of America. We cut away at that at our very peril. In my first days at West Point, I got a class on race relations in a military that was fraught with racial tensions, with drug abuse, with indiscipline. The president at that time was Richard Nixon, and the Secretary of Defense was Melvin Laird. Neither were well-known liberal progressives, but they maintained this was an important program that even in my first days at West Point, I should start learning about. And it helped me immensely as I went out to lead troops for the rest of my career. The successors of those programs exist out there today. We cannot afford to undercut them entirely, and we can't afford to tell Americans who are thinking about serving that this military is not up to their expectations. We have the best and most powerful military in the world. You heard that from our chairman at the beginning here today. We must sustain that by maintaining and growing programs to expand the number of people who are interested in the military and to make sure they understand it is a proud and honorable place to serve. Thank you.
Okay, thank you much. I'll call upon myself. First of all, I'll just make a general statement. I personally believe, I'm glad we've gone over 70 years without having a war with China, and I look forward to another 70 years, A. And B, I recently ran into an employee back in my district of a manufacturing firm. And she was a little bit sad because her company, this is in the private sector, you know, just a manufacturing firm, had gone from a very conservative company to one in which the employees had to put up with this woke training stuff. And she regretfully said she might have to look for another job. And I thought that was too bad, but I thought if that's what's going on in private, you know, who knows in an area like military what this woke training does. Now, a couple questions. First of all, we'll start with Mr. Hunt. As far as physical requirements, are the physical requirements for the military today any different than, say, what they were 30 years ago?
Thank you for that question, Chairman. The physical requirements have changed, as we've seen in a lot of the different, in the new kind of research that's come out now, in terms of the standards that are allowing people to come in the military. I would say that a lot of those types of issues are kind of room for more research, and I would hope that this body would continue to ask those types of questions. Okay,
so in other words, our military is not quite as physically strong today as they were 30 years ago, your average soldier or sailor?
No, sir.
Oh, wow. That's concerning. How about mental problems? Well, there was a time where I think mental problems would kind of disqualify someone from the military. Is there a change in the way we deal with mental problems today compared to, say, what we were dealing with 40 years ago?
There have been some changes in that regard as well, Chairman.
Could you elaborate on a little bit?
Well, I will just say that the organization I'm a part of, Vets on Duty, a lot of our research has been done with looking at how we can make sure our military is ready. We have not done a variety of research into that particular question of mental aptitude and that kind of question, but we can get back to you with some.
I think there was a time where if you were taking certain medications, you couldn't get the military. Is that still true?
Yes, sir.
Okay, more or less, or has it changed at all?
I would not be the best person to give you the
either one of the other, any of the other three know if we changed the, Mr. Sadler?
So with regards to certain specialties and ones that I'm more familiar with in the nuclear submarine community and in the ballistic missile program, there are stringent medical as well as psychological requirements that are in pre-screening and continually through the career. That has remained unchanging, at least in the last 30 years. Now, outside of that, inside my foreign area officer experience, there's a very wide spectrum of differences based on location and the stressors that you might be on. And so in that regards, it's not uniform, and it does change from time to time based on what the medical community, the military medical community, believes is important for that area, for that operation. And so you can't paint with one brush for all DoD or even one service, and it does change. Some of that, there's some things to look at more closely.
Okay, so are things getting tightened up, or are we loosening the standards?
What troubles me most when I hear from the military medicine community is that there's a tendency to get distracted from metrics or issues that are not medically focused. And again, this comes back to the influences of DEI-type policies. And that is, in my mind, a distraction from the provision of traumatic care for soldiers, airmen, and sailors that need help when they have an injury in either the day-to-day operations or in combat.
In other words, is what they're doing affected by the person they're dealing with?
There is some indication that is starting to become a mentality or a thinking that's overtaking their approach to medicine.
What would be the reason, Mr. Hunt, why we changed the physical requirements?
That particular question, I would ask many of the leaders right now in our Department of Defense, like, what is their criteria? I think a lot of times it's unclear, and I think that's part of the problem, that this body should know exactly what that criteria is.
I've been told by people in the military academies that sometimes they change the physical requirements with regard to gender or what have you. Is that true?
I think you would have to ask the Department of Defense exactly what's going on, because quite frankly,
I see Ms. Mobbs kind of says that.
Yeah.
Is it Mobbs? Mobbs? I don't even know.
Mobbs, sir.
Mobbs, okay.
That is correct, Mr. Chairman. They have changed the physical fitness standards. So when we had the Army Physical Fitness Test, which was the APFT, we switched to what was then called the Army Combat Fitness Test, and that was designed to transform the Army fitness culture and improve readiness for ground combat. Many of the events within the Army Combat Fitness Test were specifically expected to map onto combat-related things like the sled carry, the shuttle run, amongst other things. I think the broader question is that when we adopted the Army Combat Fitness Test, we did not necessarily look holistically at what kind of an overhaul of fitness culture in the military looked like. And so to that point, we can't just look at a single physical fitness test as a measure of readiness within our armed forces. We must be better about addressing kind of all pillars of fitness to include things like sleep, nutrition, cognitive, psychological, to your point, Mr. Chairman, because that is how we're going to create the most lethal fighting force.
How about when we promote people? Does any of this diversity stuff get in the way there?
So in terms of, if you're talking about specifically physical fitness, so those are used as indicators on report cards, if you will, for NCOs, junior soldiers, officers. That is the case. So they are utilized in that capacity.
Okay, so to a degree, is it ever possible that somebody would be promoted or not promoted on the margins based on diversity concerns? Mr. Sadler wants to speak.
Yeah, I can weigh in a little bit on that. A concern, and that is, if the emphasis on diversity equates with a quota or some ratio, there is an unspoken, or there can be an unspoken pressure to actually try to tip the scales in one way or the other, and that's a perception. That is something that's very real, and I would say that to say that it doesn't exist would be a falsehood.
Okay. This woke stuff. When I talk to people who work for big corporations, and maybe I don't talk enough military people, they all have a low opinion of it. How much are we spending, as far as you're concerned, with these diversity-type bureaucrats? I know we need, there's so many things we need more of in the military to preserve our country. I wonder how much we're spending on these people.
Mr. Chairman, right now the numbers are $114 million on DEI programs. In some cases, we're paying these DEI bureaucrats over $200,000 a year, which is
$200,000 for a diversity person?
triple the mean of the household income in the United States, and the average household income. So this is a major problem that we're seeing, where we're investing all of this money without any data that reflects A, if it actually works, which we know it doesn't, and B, whether what the point is, or whether there was any type of underlying data that would necessitate such dramatic increases in the funding of these programs.
Well, I'm sure it lowers morale to put up with this stuff. I mean, you like to look up to your commanding officer. You don't like to think that they're a joke. But in any event, I've used up my time, So I suppose I will go on to Mr. Garcia.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. A couple comments and some questions. Let me just first just make a couple notes. I think that there's a lot of conversations and comments about diversity and inclusion programs and diversity in the military, and I think it's important to remember that we've been diversifying our military for decades. And so this has been a priority of the United States to have a more inclusive military, a more inclusive force since the 60s and 70s. And so this isn't a new thing. This isn't like this has just started happening. This has been a critical mission of the U.S., and our military is stronger today because of the focus on inclusion and diversity. And so I just want to make that very clear. I think that's important to note for the record. Our military changing and becoming more inclusive has been a very positive thing. Our military reflects the American people, and our American people have become more diverse and more focused on these issues. So should our institutions and certainly our military. The U.S., of course, has a long history of implementing changes to the military that affect its engagement with a variety of groups. For example, obviously the integration of women into the military has been critical. The desegregation that happened across our forces have been critical. And the DoD today reports that our 1.3 million active duty personnel has, of course, greater racial, ethnic, and gender diversity than we've had in the past and from decades in the past. And so if you look at just our current force today, 17% of our active duty members are female, 31% of our active duty members identify with a racial minority, and 85% of our military officers have a BA or an advanced degree. That's actually higher than at any time, even if you look at the last decade. And so our military continues to be more reflective of the American people. It continues to get more educated. It continues to include more people. So if that's a reflection or an outcome of focusing more on diversity and focusing more on inclusion, then I welcome that. And I think that's actually a positive development as our military continues to grow. And I wanted to ask General Barno, because you mentioned some of this in your opening comments, how does a educated, racially diverse and gender diverse military actually make us stronger as a military?
I think one of the most important things to recognize, I think everyone on the panel would agree with this, is that military leadership has to build cohesive teams. That's a leadership function. That may be the most important thing that leaders do is put together cohesive teams. The United States has an immense advantage over our adversaries in that we are a very diverse culture. We since our history began, have been comprised of people from all ethnic groups, all races, all creeds, all colors, men and women. If you look to the Chinese military, you look at the Russian military, you don't see that. They are going to operate at that permanent disadvantage. Our ability to knit teams together that can function well no matter what their educational background, no matter what their race, their religious beliefs are, their gender, that's an incredible advantage the United States has always brought to the battlefield out there. That's going to make us outthink and out-innovate the enemy in any future conflict. And so building that cohesion in peacetime and recognizing that there's a way to make these differences into strengths is always something the military has tried to do. And I would just comment on briefly maybe on the chairman's points. I think we actually have higher standards today in a lot of areas than we had when I came in the Army. We certainly have a higher physical fitness standard. The new Army Combat Fitness Test is a very, very tough test for men and women both. It's much tougher than what it replaced. And we've also moved in the selection system to doing blind selections, which is far more reflective of equity without knowing. You don't know if you're seeing the promotion file on a woman or a man, what they look like. And so we've actually taken a lot of steps in the last few years.
Thank you, sir. And I completely agree with that testimony. And I thank you for reinforcing that. I also want to just note something right now. So today the GAO released a report on active duty recruitment and retention challenges. And I asked for unanimous consent to put this report in the record. As you can see from the poster behind me, the GAO identifies a number of real factors that affect military recruitment and retention, such as commercial sector employment opportunities, medical qualifications, dependent care, and family planning. Obviously, if we support our men and women in uniform rather than actually trying to score political points, we might actually make some progress on this issue. There are real challenges we should be focused on, not necessarily the ones that are being brought up today at this hearing. General Barno, broadly speaking, what actions can the military take to effectively compete for the best and the brightest?
I think the military has got to get out among the American people and become better known than it is today. It's very geographically centered where the bases are in the country. It's very family-oriented in terms of militaries being a family business. My father, all three of his brothers, myself, my three brothers, my two children all served in the U.S. military. We can't sustain the AVF on that model. So we have to get out and see the American people. They have to see what a great military this is.
Thank you, sir. And I think just to close, it's interesting we have a more diverse military today. We have more women in the military. Of course, more people of color in the military. We have a more educated military, yet somehow we're worse off today than we were before. So I don't understand that. I don't agree with that. I want to thank you all for your testimony. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. We'll go on for Mr. Sessions.
Chairman, thank you very much. It seems like we've gotten off into equity and diversity and all these other matters. I'd like to, if I can, go a little bit higher and go to the challenges of politically driven agendas, because I think politically driven agendas is more to the point rather than whether we're talking about who, but what a political agenda is. I have two questions. I'll just throw it open for you. Number one, to talk about COVID. Why do I talk about COVID? Because my nephew, who could not wait to get into West Point and served United States Army for 5 years, literally was summarily dismissed from the Army as the United States captain at the end of his 5 years because he would not submit himself to the knowledge that 30-year-old men did not do as well in the COVID experience, and the pandemic was over long before he ever had to make any decision about that. And they dismissed him. They told him his career was done. Thank you very much. Please get out. Anybody have a comment about that politically driven agenda placed on the military?
I think in general, sir, we have to be data-driven in our armed forces and the Department of Defense, and I think what you just spoke to reflects a movement away from data-driven science. What we know is that natural immunity was 2.8 times better in preventing hospitalizations, and in particular, this wasn't a risk for young people, and in particular, the vaccines for males that are young, age 16 to 29, had a pernicious risk potentially of heart and myocarditis and other associated risks.
That's the way he looked at it.
Yeah, I might add that if you come in the military, and we all have served there, the number of shots you get for all kinds of things, from yellow fever to diphtheria to, all variety of things, anthrax in my case at one point in time, is part and parcel of being in the military. COVID was something brand new. We didn't have a lot of experience in that. We had over 1.1 million Americans die of that. And I think, depending upon when the decisions were made, the military made a wise decision to try and vaccinate its people so they didn't have more incidents like USS Theodore Roosevelt having most of its crew get sick with COVID and have to not be available for deployment. So again, I would want to be looking back humble about what we knew when in that environment. And I'm not a medical professional, but I can understand the logic of the decisions that were made.
Well, perhaps we can. If we were talking about early on, that might ring true, but not later as we gain more information and learn that the initial things that we learned, in fact, were falsehoods. I'd like to move then to the political agenda of the transgender recruiting. If someone can talk with me about that, I understand that they're actively recruited. Tell me what the process for bringing them in, going through boot camp, and then what that process is, including them going through that period of time with this transition. Anybody? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Please let the record reflect that we are our people that we have today to offer testimony do not offer any insight as to the transgender recruiting, the agenda, the amount of time in that process, as well as the period of time that these individuals might be unable to serve the United States military, and what requirements would be placed upon them. So I would like to go next to a politically driven agenda, and that is what I believe is an overall belief and feeling about trying to encourage people to become a different person than what we might need as a war fighter. Just the agenda that may be placed upon them, the discussion that may be placed upon them, but that what we need is our military to be war fighters. Does anyone have an idea about this? Mr. Hunt?
Well, absolutely, Congressman. I appreciate the question. It's incredibly important, especially as we look at our threats abroad and what's going on with our adversaries, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, that our military is focused on training and developing war fighters. And so that's why many of us here are concerned about the seeming shift away from the military's core mission in a kind of a direction to more political ideas like climate change, the entire robust bureaucracy of DEI that has just exploded in this most recent presidential administration. And this is kind of a distraction from the most important task at hand, which is deterring, fighting, and winning our nation's wars.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Mr. Chairman, could I have a point of order? Could I just ask the gentleman from Texas, were you citing a particular document related to the impact of COVID?
May I ask what the point of order is first?
Just if he could just submit that document to for the record so we could all see it.
Yes. Okay, what is the point of order?
The question is whether he could submit a document that he's citing from to the record.
Yeah, that's not a point of order, though.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I would be very pleased to engage the gentleman. I was not citing anyone. I spoke about the very public information that the president was requiring COVID to be given on an order from the United States military by the commander-in-chief. And I felt like in the beginning, perhaps that could have sounded true, but as we learned more, it diminished. And my question was about the as time moved on, the diminishment of the need for this, and yet they continued their policies. I thank the gentleman.
Okay, that's enough. Now, first of all, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record two documents pertaining to today's hearing: a GAO report released today entitled DoD Active Duty Recruitment and Retention Challenges, and a letter signed by myself and other members, majority members of the committee, from September 22nd, 2021, asking for documents and communications from the White House on the firing of 18 Trump-appointed Military Service Academy board members. Let the record reflect that the White House did not respond to our inquiry. Now we'll go on to Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Army fell short of its recruitment goals by 15,000 last year. Why has it become more difficult to recruit people into the military? Here's one theory. Potential recruits are not afraid of going woke, they're afraid of going broke. Pay and benefits are so low that the RAND Corporation estimates that more than a quarter, 26% of our military service members are food insecure, and 14% actually use food assistance programs like food banks to meet their family needs. General Barno, how can our military improve the lives of our most junior service members so they don't have to struggle for basic necessities for their families, like groceries?
I think the military has done well over the last 20 years is increasing the amount of compensation that military members get, but that applies least of all to the most junior members of the force. They come in and are still making a very, very minimal amount of wages. I can recall actually qualifying for food stamps myself when I was a first lieutenant with my wife and a new baby at one point in time. So we've fixed some of those problems over the years, but we still have a problem for our force that's in the E1 to E4 category, the most junior enlisted, and we ought to devote some more attention to making sure that they have a tolerable standard of living, especially if they're married and they perhaps have dependents.
Well, I appreciate that. The Blue Star families, which I've been in touch with, suggest this is a real problem, not an illusory problem. It would be great if we actually had the Department of Defense here to speak to this question of what we're doing to compensate the newly recruited members of the armed forces. Ms. Mobbs, in your testimony, you cite a recent survey which found that 30% of Americans ages 16 to 24 say that the possibility of sexual assault, rape, or sexual harassment is one of the main reasons that they would not consider joining the military, and I'd like to submit for the record an article in the Military Times that has come out since then titled "The Military Sexual Assault Problem is Only Getting Worse." Will you elaborate on this point? To what extent do you think this is actually deterring women and men from going into the military?
Thank you, Congressman. I appreciate the question. I can't speak directly to the totality of the impact on preventing them from serving. I would say that it is clear that our focus on sexual harassment, sexual prevention within the military, those programs have not been as effective as they should have been over the years, which does decline trust in teams. And I would posit that focusing on improving programs like that are a far better use of resources than where some things are currently placed.
Well, I appreciate that, but a lot of people would say those are precisely the programs that are promoting wokeism. To talk about sexual harassment or sexual assault is actually to try to impose a bar of political correctness, to politicize the Army, to engage in social engineering. What's your response to that?
I would say that that's not the case at all. I think that the military's ultimate function is to build the strongest teams possible, and that is what its function should be, and that is regardless of identity, of gender, of race, which is why I do think some of these programs are particularly pernicious when it comes to the DEI overarching frame, which looks at individual characteristics versus building teams broadly. But to your point, Congressman, I do not think that focusing on sexual harassment or assault preventions is a bad thing. I think it is absolutely critical to build teams that have trust.
Well, I appreciate that, and I would just like to remark, as the ranking member did, that it's been an historical struggle to desegregate the Army, to let African Americans into the Army, to let women into the Army, to let gay people serve in the Army publicly. And at every point, there was a complaint that, oh, this is woke, or this is politically correct, or this is social engineering, or what have you. In fact, it's the process of democratization and making the Army look like the rest of society and allowing everybody to serve. Lieutenant General Barno, are there any studies which document the rather extraordinary claim being bandied about today that fear of wokeism or political correctness or what have you is actually depressing recruitment to the military?
I'm not aware of any studies that actually have any factual data that support that assertion. I also know that at least two service chiefs, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Berger, and the Chief Staff of the Air Force, General C.Q. Brown, have both said that wokeism is not, there's no such thing as not affecting military readiness. They see no evidence that this is a problem inside their two services. And I think that applies in the recruiting domain as well. But no, in terms of actual evidence, I've not seen that.
All right. Well, I want to thank all of the witnesses for their testimony and for their service, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. On to Mr. Biggs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. A question for each of you, and this, I hope you recognize that it's just a real short question. So I'll start with you, General. Who is the biggest geostrategic adversary of the United States today?
I would say, as the National Defense Strategy says, China.
Mr. Hunt?
China, sir.
Ms. Mobbs?
China.
Mr. Sadler?
China.
Thank you. So I think maybe you might be surprised to know that our Commander-in-Chief said on June of 2021 that global warming's our greatest threat. So it makes one wonder what the priorities of the military are. So I'm thinking of China, and with the vax mandate that we placed on our men and women in the military, 8,400 active duty left, 40,000 National Guardsmen left, 22,000 reservists also left the service. Do you know whether China placed the same kind of constraints on their military, Mr. Sadler?
Their constraints are different as a communist society. So if you don't follow or the diktat of the Communist Party, you're politically...
Did they drum you out of the service if you didn't? Well, yeah, they would. They would drum you out.
They would drum you out for political reasons, yes.
How about teaching CRT in their military academies?
I think they probably do, as it's a neo-Marxist and a Marxist ideology.
Right. DOD prioritizing climate literacy. Mr. Hunt, did they do that in China?
I've seen no evidence to suggest that they're highlighting climate readiness.
How about environmental justice in China?
Not that I'm aware of, Congressman.
How about any kind of climate goals in China?
Not to my knowledge, Congressman.
Ms. Mobbs, do you think China requires its federal defense contractors to comply with ESG and DEI requirements, as ours does?
Not to my awareness, no.
One thing that was said is that there's been no real study on this, and that individual, a couple of individuals were cited by the general, that nothing on wokeness really has an impact on. Maybe you were limiting it to recruiting. I may be wrong. I don't want to expand. I don't want to say more than you were. So I think maybe you were limiting it to recruitment. Am I right on that?
No, actually, the two service chiefs said that they did not, as I recollect, and this is fairly recent, did not see that wokeism was having any effect on the readiness of their service, that they did not see that inside the service.
I see. In May of 2021, Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hicks said, quote, "Every dollar we spend addressing the effect of climate change is a dollar that we're not putting toward other priorities like meeting the challenge posed by China and modernizing our forces," close quote. Additionally, we spent $87 million just on the Department of Defense Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity. We have also seen Air Force and the Navy paying DEI managers $180,000 a year. The person that was in charge of the DEI office of DOD at the Pentagon had to be let go for racist statements. This type of effort, whether it's climate change, whether it's gender equity, whether it's DEI, whether it's ESG mandates, seem to be diverting from military readiness and certainly might have an impact on whether individuals want to join the military. Ms. Mobbs, your comments, please.
So I think any time that dollars are pulled away from doing operational or tactical training is problematic, broadly speaking. I do think, to your point, Congressman, that level of funding directed specifically to that program is also direct evidence of implementation of a broader agenda regarding diversity, equity, inclusion that is in fact divorced from the original diversity inclusion that was spoken to by the ranking member. That is a drastic shift from what previously was acknowledged as being diversity inclusion efforts that supported bringing in kind of more women or things like that, but were not necessarily rooted in the critical race theory ideology that DEI is currently.
That we are teaching at our military academies. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member for holding this hearing. I think it's very important. I had the privilege of chairing this National Security Subcommittee for the past two Congresses, during which time we examined several critical issues affecting military recruitment and retention, including multiple CODELs by multiple members here on this committee to Fort Hood, Texas. Fort Hood has historically struggled with a crisis of homicides, suicides, and sexual assaults among troops who are stationed there, with 11 homicides and over 50 suicides in the last 5 years, and widespread reports of sexual assault. Importantly, in 2020, we initiated an extensive oversight investigation following reports of, again, sexual harassment and sexual assault at Fort Hood, an Army installation that has witnessed nearly 30 service member deaths in 1 year, one single year, including Army Specialist Vanessa Guillen and my constituent, Army Sergeant Elder Fernandez from the city of Brockton in my district. Our investigation was followed by the removal and suspension of various members of senior leadership at Fort Hood. Just last year, we conducted robust oversight surrounding the management of the JROTC program, Junior Reserve Officer Training Corps. This program is instrumental in developing our young people who may be inspired to embark on a life dedicated to military or civilian public service. Regrettably, our investigation found serious gaps in the processes undertaken by DOD and the military services to address allegations of sexual misconduct made against JROTC instructors. General Barno, would you further discuss the impact of these incidences of sexual assault and other sexual misconduct on recruitment and retention efforts?
I believe there are several surveys out there, I've seen some of them, that suggest that one of the major deterrents for young Americans signing on to join U.S. military is a belief that they will be at risk, that they could be male or female sexually assaulted or sexually harassed during their time in uniform, and even beyond that, that they have a high chance of becoming injured or traumatically distressed by their time in service. And so this is a huge perception out there, and as several of the members have noted, this has not gotten a great deal better in recent years, especially the issues of military sexual assault. So I think it's an area where the services need to double down on what they're doing and find out what is causing this. But again, as with Fort Hood, the leadership aspect of this is a critical component, getting the leadership right.
Thank you, Lieutenant General, and thank you as well for your service. As a matter of fact, supporting your testimony, according to the latest military propensity update released by the Department of Defense, 30% of DOD youth poll participants indicated that, quote, the possibility of sexual harassment and assault is the main reason why they would not consider joining the military. General Barno, the National Defense Authorization Act that was enacted by Congress last year and signed by President Biden included several military justice reforms designed to combat sexual assault and harassment in the military. Could you discuss the importance of these reforms to establish a culture within our military that alleviates some of the enlistment concerns expressed by our young people who aspire to serve in the military?
This is going to take time for this change to take hold and for it to be publicized among young citizens that are thinking about service, but it essentially takes, after many years of studying this and evaluating this, and initially a lot of opposition to the military, there's been removed from the military chain of command oversight for the investigation and prosecution of felony-level cases such as sexual assault or other felonies, murders, et cetera, so that commanders themselves are no longer the direct investigators and ultimately the judicial authorities for that. That's a huge sea change inside the military. We haven't seen anything like this in my lifetime, and I think it's going to take hold and eventually provide some additional credibility for prosecution of people that are suspected of these offenses.
Thank you. And lastly, General Barno, would you agree that it's vital for us to demonstrate to those eager to serve our country in uniform and their families, especially the families, that we do not take the health and safety of our service members lightly?
No, I think that's critical. Individual young men and women don't make these decisions to join by themselves. They rely upon the advice from their family members, their teachers, their coaches, and if those older adults in the room don't perceive the military as safe for these people, they will never recommend they join.
Right. Thank you, General. I thank all the witnesses. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, and I yield back.
Thanks much. Mr. Fallon?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all the witnesses for coming today. General Barno, do you think the Ukrainian armed forces right now are currently conducting sensitivity training?
I have no knowledge of that, but I would be surprised.
Yeah, and probably not concerned about pronouns either, maybe more concerned about the 100,000 casualties they've suffered at the hands of the Russian aggressor, probably more focused on the 20,000 plus civilians that have been indiscriminately murdered by the Russian regime. And you listen, the military is overburdened. Y'all know it, we know it, they know it. And not, wasting time on valuable, quote unquote, training like sensitivity training, diversity, equity, inclusion. I'm far more concerned, not concerned about diversity, I'm far more concerned about the word talent. Because when you seek out talent, you'll get the diversity. We're a very diverse nation. And as a conservative, we understand that success comes in all shapes, sizes, and shades. I was in the military 30 years ago, and the first thing they did when you get into training, when you finish your training and go on active duty, is they talked about the isms, and there was zero tolerance for it, because this is about culture. There was no room for racism or sexism or nepotism, and that was zero tolerance. You get kicked out. So you build a culture over decades. And now we see that a lot on the left, and particularly in this administration, want the military to fight their political wars instead of preparing for an actual, real, hot fighting war. I'm on the Armed Services Committee, we had the Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman sitting in the witness chair and saying that he wanted to understand white rage, and he's white. That's a political statement. General Barno, do you think that there's a serious problem in today's military with political extremism?
I think political extremism exists in the military as it does in society, and I know that it's not tolerated in the military.
Yeah, sir, but do you think it's a serious problem?
It's a very serious problem with any individuals that serve in uniform that believe in those beliefs.
I think there's one too many, but it's clearly not a serious problem because after much pulling of teeth and gnashing, we got some answers that in 2020, do you have any idea how many Army, active duty, or Guard, or reservists were separated for military political extremism?
No, I do not.
It was 9 out of 1.1 million. The Marine Corps, out of 222,000 active and reserve, it was 4. I don't believe that's a serious problem. We had the Secretary of Defense stand down the military in a staggered fashion and probably burned at least $230 million on training to remove, they're worried about 9, 4, I mean, a couple of dozen. I think that was a terrible waste of taxpayer money. We can't read our recruiting goals. And when we start seeing 20,000, my contacts in the Army are saying that we're going to miss our mark by 20 or 30,000 this year. I hope that's not the case. But you keep doing that year over year, you're not going to have a military. We lose the military, and we're not lethal, and we can't deter, and we can't project power. We're going to lose this country. It's a massive problem. And when you look at, they do these pulse surveys that when you combined potential recruits' concerns for wokeism, the way they handled COVID and other recent events, 21% didn't even want to serve in the military. We only have 23% of the Americans that can serve, 9% are interested in serving, and less than 1% do serve. So I'm very concerned about the direction. I don't want my military to be, I don't want Democratic generals, and I don't want Republican generals. Damn it, I want American generals. I don't want to know your politics. We have some that serve like that, and then we have others that are serving political masters and wearing their ideology on their sleeve and then shoving it down the American people's throats. We don't want that. That's the one thing that unites us, is our military. And I don't want this administration to deter that very narrow pool to service. Because if you grow up not loving this country and believing it's worth fighting for, you're not going to serve. And there's too many people in the political arena that are doing just that. They're deterring, and they're teaching young people, particularly at the universities, that America, on balance, is a net negative for the world. Always has been, always will be, unless we follow some socialist, Marxist path. I wanted to tour North Korea. I wanted to tour Venezuela. I wanted to tour Iran, and I especially wanted to deter and detour Russia and China. And thank all the witnesses, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Goldman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of our witnesses for your service. My colleague from Texas just mentioned the Ukraine's military preparedness in fighting Russian aggression. And General Barno, I'd like to know from your vast experience in the military how you believe that the Ukraine military that is bravely fighting for democracy against Russian aggression feels when politicians on the far right express support for Vladimir Putin over Ukraine.
Well, I don't think I can answer that question since I'm not part of that force, but I do understand that they model themselves in many ways on the U.S. military, that they have been trained, as one of my colleagues here has trained the Ukrainians in the past, by American military forces, and the American military is the model for the most aspiring armies in the world, and the Ukrainians are certainly part of that. So I think they admire this force that we're so concerned about here in ways that perhaps is greater than some Americans do as we look at it today.
Mr. Hunt, can you please define the term woke?
Congressman, I describe it as a loose collection of progressive political ideas that are constantly thrust upon our institutions in the United States.
What progressive ideals? What do you mean thrust upon our institutions?
So thrust upon our institutions, so Secretary Austin making an unprecedented statement after a Supreme Court decision having the military weigh in on the most polarizing political issue of our time about abortion. I would say at my alma mater, West Point, getting a lecture on whiteness. When I was there, we weren't getting lectures like that. I don't understand why that's now being a part of the curriculum there. We have at the Air Force Academy, there are now cadet DEI officials walking around writing up their fellow classmates. And of course, we have the Air Force Academy professor who proudly teaches critical race theory and wrote about it in a very public op-ed in the Washington Post. So I think it's fair to say that all these are very kind of political in nature. These are ideas that we want our military to be apolitical. We don't want a Democrat military or a Republican military. We want an apolitical military focused on their mission to deter, fight, and win our nation's wars.
That's a long definition, but thank you. You know, the other thing that I think is getting lost here, and I don't think anyone disagrees with you, that we would like to have a military that is apolitical and prepared. General Barno, the question I have for you is, describe for us the benefits of having a diverse military.
As I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons the U.S. military is the envy of other militaries in the world is because of the incredible teams of diverse individuals that we have. If I go to any other major military, they're almost all homogeneous in terms of their racial background, their ethnic background. Few have as many women as we have in the force. So we bring a lot to the table in terms of thinking around all aspects of a problem and be able to harness that energy and get great synergy about having all those different kind of people that work together as teams in our military. That's what every military would like to do. And we can bring in a lot of different thinkers with different backgrounds and experiences that, again, if you're a Russian or even a Ukrainian for that matter, certainly a Chinese, you don't have that wealth of diversity to draw upon.
Mr. Sadler, you mentioned in your opening statement the benefits of the Navajo code talkers, and I believe you also referenced the benefits of having women in the military in Afghanistan being able to relate to women, which are clearly benefits of having diversity. Would you also agree that language accessibility in other countries is also a benefit to the military?
No, absolutely. I was a foreign area officer for about 8 years or so, the tail end of my career because of my growing up in Asia. So absolutely, that regional language, cultural understanding definitely does have a military utility, and that really should be part of the focus in forming this discussion about diversity.
Right. Well, in 2022, the DoD released a report that found that 12% of the military stated that they experienced an unhealthy climate in the military. And this group was far more likely to identify as a racial or ethnic minority, a woman, or not heterosexual. The point of DEI is to make minorities, racial or ethnic minorities, or other underrepresented populations feel included, so they do not have to identify as in having an unhealthy climate. And I think that that point is very lost in much of what your testimony is here today. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Just a little bit of housekeeping here. On behalf of Representative Biggs, I ask unanimous consent to submit to the record a series of public reports on military readiness, and also on behalf of Representative Raskin, I submit to the record papers which he forwarded to the committee. So, unanimous request. So ordered. Representative Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for your service in uniform. We certainly appreciate it. The country does. I want to turn to you, sir, General Barno. When you, in your opening statements, you said there was no data and no correlation regarding the description of woke policy, or what have you, and the reduction in recruiting that has also been referenced multiple times in this hearing. What do you have any data at all that you referred to when you say there is no data and no correlation? Do you know of any studies that have been conducted in this regard?
No, my point is that there is no data that says that there is a correlation between wokeness and recruiting, so I can't document data that there is no data for.
So I'd agree with you, right? It's hard to quantify, I think, for a lot of people, But you certainly can't say that there's no correlation if there's no data. There could be a correlation. Just because you don't have the data or we don't have the data doesn't mean there's no correlation. It just means you don't have any.
Yeah, we don't have any evidence that says that.
Right.
A more accurate way to say that, I think.
You've got a long and storied career in the U.S. Army, serving command at all levels. And you talked about eligibility and propensity. For instance, when did eligibility change? When did it go to 30%? Do you know? Were you still serving in uniform?
I think it's been that way for over a decade. So
okay,
probably
I would
yes.
agree with
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
I would agree because I've heard the issue for some time, and I was serving during that last decade. So I would agree with you. So if it's been over a decade that we've had an eligibility, if not a propensity problem, an eligibility problem, how do you explain that it's the worst now since 1973? So this has been going on a long time. 25% in the Army. You're in my alma mater, right? Our branch of the service. How do you explain the lack of ability to recruit 15,000 short if the eligibility has generally remained the same? What's changed if that hasn't changed?
You know, one of the points, and I would like, I think, to submit our article that we wrote here a couple of weeks ago on military recruiting for the record, but it specifies in there the drop from 30 to 23% last year is
so you
a
attribute
huge
it
drop.
all to that 7% drop?
That is a significant factor
I
in terms of the number of
understand it's
people that are out there.
significant, but can you positively attribute it to that? Does your
Attribute what? The loss
the lack of
lack
recruiting.
numbers last year?
Yeah.
I think that is part of the
Part.
answer
How much?
for last year.
How much?
I don't know.
Yeah,
I think
that's the
if you have
point.
fewer people that can actually serve,
Yeah, absolutely.
logically, that you're going to have a more difficult time recruiting.
Absolutely. I think that the Army, the military, the uniformed services should focus generally on two things. I'll just ask for each: lethality and readiness. Those two things. Any disagreement, Mr. Sadler, Dr. Mobbs, Mr. Hunt, sir?
I don't disagree.
Okay. So with that, because you've served at all levels, did you always have enough time to train to proficiency in all the warfighting functions required for your units to be effective?
I think no one has enough time to train to the perfect level.
I completely agree. So how much time is appropriate to train on things like DEI, climate change, whiteness, or CRT? How much time did you want your service members to sit there and endure that?
I want to make sure my teams work, and if my teams are composed of diverse individuals, I want to make sure we understand how to work together.
I agree with you. So when you joined and when I joined, I served with people from Texas or New York. I served with women. I served with men, black men, white men, Asian men, Catholic, Jewish. You know what we all did? We all got the same haircut. We put the same hat on. We shined our boots the same way. We used the same weapon. If that worked for all your career and all of my career, and it did, diversity of thought, diversity of background, diversity of capability, diversity in every single way, and it worked. Did it work when you were at command?
As I mentioned, I started receiving diversity training when I was a plebe at West Point. So we've done this for the 30 years of my career.
Was it to the extent that it is now when you were a plebe at West Point?
I think it may be because the Army was suffering immense problems with race relations.
So throughout your career, you kept revisiting it at the same level it's being imposed now.
I can't actually measure it year to year, but it was certainly a significant part.
Well,
of
it wasn't
my
a significant
career.
part of mine because we knew what the right thing was, and our focus was on lethality and readiness. We knew who was going to get the job done. We knew we were from diverse backgrounds. It didn't matter because we were focused on the mission, sir, and the mission for commanders, for the military, is lethality. And our mission as leaders is lethality and readiness to make sure we're prepared. And anything that focuses on anything other than that is a waste of our time, sir. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Frost?
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. I come from a military family. My father was in the Air Force, was actually in the Air Force Band, I think one of the greatest recruitment tools. My grandfather was a first sergeant. I wanted to join the Air Force after I watched A Few Good Men, but found out I couldn't because of my asthma. So I joined the nation, America's best kept secret, the Civil Air Patrol, and you know, that was all I could do. But either way, you know, we've had many, many hearings on this committee. I feel like we're getting to a place where we're valuing, not me, but our friends on the other side are valuing quantity over quality. Because as I hear a lot of the lines of questioning coming from my colleagues, they're just ridiculous, wild, or not founded on facts. I mean, number one, this hearing is about the military, and instead we just heard one of my colleagues disrespect retired Lieutenant General Barno here, lecturing him on what military readiness is. Another colleague went on a wild rant about China, asking you each about China and what they're doing with their military. And his line of questioning to me sounded like he thinks the U.S. military should act more like the Chinese military, and I just wonder if he actually believes that. And then we also have wild questions about transgender folks in the military, and I just, you know, from one of my colleagues, and when we're talking about problems about recruitment and retention, I'm not sure telling transgender soldiers that they don't belong in the military or that they are not fit to serve is the right thing to do when we talk about recruitment and retention. I'm here to find solutions rooted in facts. It's been stated time and time again, no data shows that DEI or woke or whatever impacts recruitment, retention, or confidence in the military in a big way. And I think it's really important to know that these efforts, when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and they've been under many names, have been part of the U.S. military ever since the draft was abolished in 1973. And these efforts traditionally have been supported by both Democrats and Republicans in Congress. But I think because now we're seeing that the politics is kind of shifting, and I guess woke is part of the Republican talking points now, we're having a hearing on this. I even heard somebody bring up, one of the witnesses, an unspoken rule on pressures of promotions can be based on quotas or DEI or et cetera. I think it's important to know 76% of active duty officers in the U.S. military right now are white. And so I highly doubt that there's an unspoken pressure that is pushing people to promote based on DEI, race, or et cetera. Our military has about 1.3 million active personnel. However, women recruits continue to climb. Men still make up 82% of our military. I think it's important to know that recent surveys have found that an estimate 21% of women in the military and about 4% of men have experienced unwanted sexual contact in the prior year. Mr. Sadler, would you say that staggering numbers like that might contribute to some of the lapse in recruitment we've seen?
Well, I think you have to also put it in the context of the nation, because the military is a part of the American society.
But do you think that's part of the numbers we're seeing in recruitment going down?
It's one of the parts, but it's
okay. Thank you so much.
It's not a new part.
General Barno, 50. Yes, it's not new. Sexual harassment has been around. What we're seeing that when we talk about these programs, we're looking to bring those numbers down. And I think we also have to look at the way that our military personnel live. And that's a huge reason why we're seeing lapse in recruitment. General Barno, 15 years ago, the U.S. Army established SHARP, a program to combat sexual assault in the ranks. Former Secretary of the Army Ryan McCarthy said, "It is clear we have significant work to do to regain our soldiers' trust in our sexual harassment and assault response." What additional steps do you think the military can take to accomplish this?
I think the U.S. Army, who has the SHARP program, has been dissatisfied with the results of that. Certainly, we haven't seen the numbers go down, and I know that's a concern for all military leaders out there. My own exploration into that, having 2 sons on active duty during part of that time, is that I don't think the chain of command owned that program as much as they needed to make a difference. I think it became a program where, as with other programs, implementation of the program is a problem. The idea and the goals are laudable, but the implementation needed to be focused on the chain of command making that case to their soldiers, and I don't think that's how it was set up.
Thank you for your response. And while the military has been moving in the right direction on this, with these modest improvements, there's a lot more that needs to be done. I mean, it wasn't enough to save people like Private Nicole Burnham, who was sexually assaulted twice shortly after being stationed in South Korea and took her own life after her command did nothing. This is not an issue of wokeness. We're talking about the women in our military that are serving our country, defending our freedom, that deserve to not be assaulted in the workplace. And we, as members of Congress, need to look at how are we protecting them, how are we ensuring that the quality of life for our service members are better than it is right now. And I want to ask, when we're here talking about wokeness, where is the outrage on ensuring that we can raise wages of military members? 74% of our military budget goes towards contractors. Why are we not talking about that? Why are we not talking about what happened just last week on this committee in this room, where my friends on the other side of the aisle were gunning and going for telework, which military spouses disproportionately use to help support their household because the wages are not where it needs to be. So this is about politics, not about policy. It's not about things rooted in facts, and the facts show, there's no data that shows that wokeness is a part of the problems we're seeing in terms of recruitment. Thank you. I yield back.
Okay. Next we have Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, a gradual emasculation of our country has been happening for decades. So the modern progressive woke movement is not completely to blame. But we seek truth in this committee, so let's talk about it. And the first truth I'll acknowledge is my deep respect for General Scott Perry, a combat veteran, has earned the right to ask his fellow combat veteran anything he wants to ask him on his committee. I joined the Army in 1988, went through boot camp in 89, Military Police Academy right after, one station unit training, Fort McClellan. I didn't join for money. I left money to serve my country. That's why most young soldiers, with the encouragement of their family, which I'll get to in a moment, that's why most young soldiers join the Army. In society, woke is a social discussion. But in the military, woke is weak. And that's the problem. In the 90s, I recall a recruiter friend, he called me. He said, Clay, most of these youngsters were trying to sign up by now. They'd never been in a fist fight. It was an issue. The Army had to make adjustments. Said these kids have never climbed a tree, never been in a fist fight. So this thing has been gradual for a long time. To not acknowledge that is not squared away. That was the 90s. On March the 1st of this year, I was struck looking at the front page of the Epic Times. There's almost 80% of Americans aged 17 to 24 unfit for military service. Department of Defense report says 77% of young Americans physically unqualified to enter the Army, enter the military. Unbelievable. And I was researching at that time the Secretary of the Navy for a meeting with him. Same day, from his website and the Epic Times, same day, most pressing challenges confronting the United States Navy and Marine Corps. 3 of the top 4, climate instability, COVID's ongoing impact, and strengthening a naval culture of inclusiveness and respect. Not readiness and lethality, as this highly qualified combat commanding general noted earlier. Climate change and diversity and COVID. 3 of the top 4 concerns of our United States Navy right now. Since the United States ended the draft in 1973, young adults from southern states have been overrepresented among new military recruits. No other region experienced as wide a disparity in military representation versus population. That's the way it works. Southern states have been providing the bulk of our military recruits for a long time. And what's happening now is families are holding our youngsters back, General. Families are saying, don't join. You're right. I cite your own words, good sir. During the first years of the recent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, many military experts worried that the constant deployments would break the force, since they expected that fewer young Americans would volunteer to serve in a wartime military. thankfully, that didn't happen. Yet a perilous recruiting crisis began just after the United States fully withdrew from Afghanistan last summer, when Biden was the president, when woke began in the military. We had young American families willing to go and join the military during heavy warfare. These are your words, General, from an article you wrote. So warfare didn't stop young Americans and American families from joining the Army, but woke has, because we're Southern families, we're conservative families, and we're not going to encourage our young men and women to join and endure that stuff. I'd like to have 5 hours with these folks, Mr. Chairman, but it appears my Southern drawl has absorbed my 5 minutes here.
Right, somebody ought to do a study and see if that same speech was read by someone from the North. Oh, but in any event, Congressman Gosar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today's military leadership has become the world's laughingstock, more concerned about appeasing the left-wing ideologues than about having the world's most lethal fighting forces. 8,400 members of our military were kicked out because they refused an ineffective, harmful, and deadly vaccine. The U.S. military is permitting the recruitment of mentally troubled people who think they were born in the wrong gender, and is even paying for their sex change surgeries and harmful chemical infusions. The Navy is hosting drag shows on their ships. By the way, I don't think China and Iran are too worried about diversity and gender ideology. Military schools are focused on describing oral sex, masturbation, and pornography in books too disgusting to mention out loud in this committee room. Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, issued, quote, a stand down of the entire military in 2021 because he falsely believed the military is systematically racist. What an insult to our brave men and women. General Milley, instead of fulfilling his constitutional duty to serve Donald Trump, the duly elected president at the time, representing the voice of the American people, conspired with both Nancy Pelosi and foreign adversary, the CCP, on separate occasions to hatch plans to overthrow the sitting president of the United States. What insurrection, you say? The point of all these actions is clear. Cleanse the military of conservatives. And the consequences are devastating. Recruitment is down, morale is down, our enemies are emboldened. It needs to stop. Mr. Sadler and Mr. Hunt, in what ways does graphically describing oral sex, masturbation, and pornography in military children's school books help military families?
I can't think of any circumstance that it would.
Mr. Hunt?
It doesn't.
And how does paying for sex change surgeries and chemical infusions ensure military readiness? Mr. Sadler?
It doesn't, and in fact, that's a distraction from resources and time of a service member that should be serving, that have to be in medical and psychological care before going back to active duty. So absolutely not.
Mr. Hunt?
I think it's an embarrassment for our Department of Defense.
So how has Lloyd Austin's stand down due to the imagined white supremacy improved military readiness? Can you think of anything, Mr. Sadler?
I think it was completely and wholly unnecessary when you look at the figures before, during, and after the events of January 6th, which was the trigger for this event. None of the facts bear reason for his action, and it hasn't changed anything. In fact, the data collection has gotten a little better, but it still needs to go along further to get better, and the annual reports from DoD, but there's no no statistical change.
Mr. Hunt?
Absolutely, I agree with my colleague here. There is no statistical change. If you look at the numbers, this year they looked at it and said there might be 100 cases of supposed extremism. That's out of 2.1 million people in the armed forces. That's 0.005% of our military is supposed extremists, but yet our Secretary of Defense shut down the military for that reason.
It's crazy. So now, how does throwing out thousands of soldiers for refusing to take a deadly experimental vaccine that led to over 20,000 deaths and over 1 million injuries affect morale? And that's just statistics up to date. How would that affect the morale, Mr. Hunt?
I think it would absolutely destroy morale in a lot of units in our military.
Would you agree, Mr. Sadler?
I think the way in which it was executed was definitely lacking. The military has a history of this with anthrax. But if it is a lawful military order, you have to take the vaccine, unfortunately. how they actually dealt with religious exceptions and other follow-up and the way that they drum people out, that I think needs to be reviewed and probably rectified.
Continuing on that line of questioning, do you support looking back at these individuals that were excused from or forced out of the military? They weren't excused, to be able to come back fully pensioned?
Absolutely. I think they should have their situations reviewed.
Do you agree with that, Mr. Hunt?
I do, absolutely.
Gotcha. What kind of message does General Milley's communications with Nancy Pelosi and the CCP behind President Trump's back sending to rank-and-file military members? Mr. Sadler?
It sends a politicized one, quite frankly, and it's simply put.
Does it belong to the military?
Absolutely not. Not for uniformed military leaders.
Who's the commander-in-chief?
President.
Mr. Hunt?
I think it sends a message that our senior DOD officials seem to be more focused on political political projects than actually the insurance of readiness in our force.
Last question. Should they be held accountable? Mr. Sadler?
Absolutely.
Mr. Hunt?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Armstrong?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like the rest of my Republican colleagues, I'm concerned that politics is getting in the way of our military carrying out its vital mission. The Department of Defense on its own website states, our mission is to provide the military forces needed to deter war and ensure our nation's security. To me, that is a very clear mission statement. But this administration has pulled out of thin air requirements that have nothing to do with the stated military mission. For example, in 2021, President Biden issued a pair of executive orders demanding that our military tackle the climate crisis as an essential element of national security and address the impacts of climate change by developing a climate action plan. This led to the military leaning into environmental justice, changing all non-tactical vehicles to electric by 2035, and the GSA proposing new emission standards for federal contractors. In that list, I heard absolutely nothing that prepares our troops to deter war and ensure our nation's security. Instead, perhaps our Democratic colleagues would like us to look like the shining example of climate virtuosity. China. China was responsible for 26% of the global emissions in 2019. The People's Republic of China now has the world's largest solar energy capacity. Moreover, the International Energy Agency states that China's share in all key manufacturing stages of solar panels exceeds 80%. Sounds like China is making great strides towards clean energy. But this is built on the backs of the Uyghurs, a Muslim minority population that China is desperately trying to eradicate by forcing them into re-education camps and slave labor. The United States Department of Labor estimates that up to 45% of the material used to manufacture solar panels comes from the province in which the Uyghurs reside. How can clean energy truly be clean when it's built on the backs of slave labor? And while China is using slave labor to fool my Democratic colleagues into believing they are a paragon of climate change, the administration is running around in circles attempting to catch up with these false statistics rather than relying on what's actually necessary for our military to succeed. I support any energy policy that lowers costs of energy for Americans, and similarly, I support any energy policy that helps our military fulfill its mission to deter war. I do not see that all in these progressive policies in our nation's fighting force. Mr. Hunt, DoD policies mandate that all military non-tactical vehicles transition to electric vehicles by 2035. Electric vehicles rely on lithium-ion batteries. The International Energy Agency states that today's battery and mineral supply chains revolves around China. China produces 3/4 of the lithium-ion batteries and is home to 70% of production capacity cathodes and 85% of anodes. Over half of the world's lithium, cobalt, graphite processing and refining capacity is located in China. Do you think it is in the best interest of American national security to be so reliant on China for sourcing lithium-ion batteries that are essential for electric vehicles Democrats are demanding our military rely on?
No, I did not.
Mr. Sadler, this summer I joined my Republican Energy and Commerce Committee colleagues in sending a letter to EPA Administrator asking for information on potential blackouts and grid instability. Like the military, California announced that all new cars sold must be electric by 2035. Yet just 2 days later, California's electric grid was in crisis and officials were asking citizens not to charge their electric vehicles. If California cannot handle its current electric demands, I fail to see how it will thrive when so many new electric vehicles enter the market. Do you have any concerns about converting all non-tactical military vehicles to electric by 2035?
Actually, I have two concerns with this. One, if the military...
Just two, because I have more.
Oh, two big ones to mention on this particular topic. One, if there is a war that occurs with China, it's going to rely on military footprint that's in the West Coast. California, obviously, home to a lot of these bases. If their infrastructure and logistics can't support military operations, or the military can't have access to reliable energy, then that has a tactical impact on a war that could occur this decade. The second thing is, if you have a platform that's only reliable on an electrical source, and you don't have multiple ways of providing it that electrical energy, either solar out in the field, as well as maybe a diesel generator located from place to place, you hamstring your operational resiliency. And so therefore it comes with a tactical cost. And I think right now the intent is just in the United States. That mitigates only on that second point, but not on the first if we get into a fight with China.
Ms. Mobbs, last week, a headline on Defense One read, "Wokeism is not an issue, top military leaders say." The byline read, "Inclusion is actually a critical part of unit cohesion," Air Force Chief and Marine Commandant said. Air Force Chief of Staff General C.Q. Brown and Marine Commandant General David Berger gave exclusive interviews to Defense One on the topic of this hearing. How do you refute their claims, both as a former service member and an expert on the issue?
Do I have time to respond?
I'm towards the end, so I'm assuming yes, but I'm not in charge.
Oh, yeah, sure, absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congressman, I think that's a very important question, because I think ultimately what we're seeing here right now is the use of language to try to dissuade or dismiss some very real concerns about what DEI looks like, what diversity, equity, inclusion looks like in its current form. And the reality is actually there is data that suggests that woke practices are impacting recruitment and retention that does need to be answered. For example, the reason why the Reagan National Survey found a major decrease in confidence in the military was 30% cited woke practices undermining military effectiveness. That data does exist. Secondarily, the Monitoring the Future survey, which has measured representative samples nationally of 12th graders since 1975, found in fact that the biggest decrease was among Democratic white men. In 2018, 18% of them expressed a desire to serve in the military. That is now only 2.9%. So that is a precipitous drop in a specific population receiving messages around what the military looks like with regard to things like diversity, equity, inclusion. And I think it's very important that we begin talking about that, not in this kind of necessarily broad woke framework, but what the data actually shows in terms of how that impacts desire to serve and propensity to want to serve our nation.
Thank you. Thank you. I should have talked less and let you talk more. I apologize. I yield back.
Very good. Mr. LaTurner?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. It's a time of significant geopolitical upheaval. The fog of war hovers over Ukraine, communist China is increasing their aggression, and individuals on the terrorist watch list are slipping into our country through our porous southern border. Alarmingly, given this context, I've received numerous complaints from enlisted members of our military regarding the waste of valuable time and capital on frivolous matters like affirmational pronoun training and subject matter adjacent to critical race theory. The Biden administration is prioritizing short-term political gains over our long-term national security. One of Congress's foremost duties is ensuring our brave servicemen and women have the resources that they need to defend America's interests at home and abroad. America's combat readiness is incumbent upon our troops' ability to fight alongside one another as a cohesive unit under one flag, regardless of demographic or creed. If service members are taught to view one another with suspicion on account of their upbringing, or come to believe they're fighting on behalf of a country built upon inherently flawed principles, America's military strength will continue to be undermined. Forcing progressive ideology on our service members threatens to degrade the morale, camaraderie, and effectiveness of our armed forces. It's also important to note that American taxpayers are unknowingly subsidizing this divisive rhetoric. Recruiting shortfalls and the relaxation of physical standards have become a feature of the Biden administration DoD agenda. I have long been a proponent of big stick ideology, but deterrence through militaristic strength doesn't work while we're wielding a twig. Mr. Sadler, your colleagues at the Heritage Foundation, Travis Fisher and Maya Clark, have recently written about a proposed change by the Biden administration to the federal acquisition regulations I find deeply concerning. This pending rulemaking would force arbitrary greenhouse gas emission standards as determined by the Paris Climate Accord upon the Department of Defense and other major federal suppliers and contractors. Not only would this weaken our defense industrial base and materials procurement capabilities, but it'd take approximately $4 billion to implement this asinine rule. You could purchase 42 F-35 fighter jets for that sum. In your opinion, is there something else DoD contractors should be prioritizing over their greenhouse gas emissions?
Quite a long list, actually. And if we are hamstrung by resources and budgets, levying more requirements and more cost on an already overly constrained budget and resourcing to build the military needed and also have contractors provide the supplies we need, it's the wrong direction. And in fact, at a dangerous time. What would be better would be to look at what the military requirements, look at what the services need in capability and capacity and readiness, and fund to that. Transitioning to a green energy or transitioning into new regulations to try to meet a Paris Accord requirement distract from that, and we certainly don't have, in a time when we don't have the resources for it.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I think we've got everybody here. I'd like to yield to Ranking Member Garcia one more time. He's got some closing remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Want to just begin by reading a couple consent and following items into the record. An article by General Barno on addressing the recruiting crisis. Also, a previous article by General Barno and Dr. Bensahel on the curse of racism in the military. A statement from Ms. Kathy Roth-Bouquet of Blue Star Families as well. So if I can put those into the record before I make my comments. We've heard a lot of testimony today, some of it, quite frankly, harmful. Much of the comments that we heard today, I think we would have heard in hearings, in congressional hearings, in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and some in the 90s. Now, our military is drawn from our incredible people, reflects our ideals and its diversity. Our military will continue to change, as does our country. I also want to address this idea that's been said over and over again that the military is being used by the woke left for some sort of social engineering agenda. Was it woke for President Truman to desegregate the armed forces in 1948? During the Vietnam War, we saw racial tensions between black Americans and black servicemen and white servicemen. Was it woke then to address those issues for black servicemen? Was it woke when we finally allowed gay men and women to serve openly in the military? Was it woke when we currently try to protect service members from rape or sexual assault? So each of those policies at the time were considered by many progressives, traditionalists, and the right wing as a version of woke or a version too far or too diverse or too inclusive. And so I think that we're just hearing the same thing over again. As we know, the military continues to be the best in the world, and we all continue to support that mission. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. First of all, so ordered on the paper you have there. I'd like to thank you all for being here today. I wish you could go another couple hours because there were some questions there at the end that I thought the answers were so very good, and I think it's too bad some of our guys only got 4 minutes or 5 minutes to question. It's scary what you're telling us, which is kind of in line with what I've heard from talking to people in the military. I don't know whether Lieutenant General Barno knows it, but anywhere in the real world with this pronoun training is considered kind of embarrassing and foolish. I'm disappointed to see we have some of that in our military. I think lowering physical standards is a scary thing. The reason the standards were there in the first place. And our goal should be to be, as Mr. Perry said, a lethal fighting force, not one excessively concerned with bean counting. I think when you get over concerned with this diversity stuff, as Mr. Sadler said, there's always concerns that promotions will be made not on the basis of the best person to give us the best fighting force, but to make the form look the best. It's shocking to me that we pay people over $200,000 a year to do this diversity training. I mean, these people almost by definition, when they get a major in something like this, are inundated in their head with this idea that we have a horrible racist America and we have to do something about it. So I think they would be overpaid for free. The fact that they're paid $200,000 when we are short of money in our military makes it all the more scandalous. And it's scary that people at the top of the military apparently have some such warped thinking that they think this is a good expenditure of funds. But in any event, I'm glad you were here today. If you have anything more to give our committee, please give us more. It was a great hearing, and a lot of people sure missed out on it, all the empty seats we have behind you guys. But again, thank you for being here one more time, and hopefully Congress will do what we can to do what the average fighting man and woman wants and stand up to, as the corporate world has to put up with, stand up to some of the woke people who somehow have got themselves to the top. I suppose, there's a certain type of person, both in the corporate world and the military, that seems to work their way to the top, and that's a shame. And I think that's what we're educated on today. So thank you one more time. And and with that, and without objection, all members have 5 legislative days within which to submit materials and submit additional written questions for the witnesses, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. If there's no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.